There's something surreal about the way memories wrap around the present, warping what you thought was real. My wife, Emily, and I had a life people envied. We were the couple others aspired to emulate. Warm smiles at neighborhood cookouts, inside jokes whispered across crowded rooms, and that palpable chemistry that made strangers guess we were still in the honeymoon phase, even after 10 years of marriage. But cracks began to show. It started with late nights at her studio. Emily was an artist, a painter with a soul as vibrant as her canvases. She claimed the quiet of the night allowed her creative energy to flourish. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. But when the calls became shorter and the excuses thinner, my chest tightened with an unnamed fear. Then came the text. It was a random Tuesday when I got it, a picture sent by an unknown number. It showed Emily at a wine bar, laughing, her face glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. The man beside her, leaning in far too close, was someone I hadn't seen in decades but recognized immediately, Jackson. My best friend from childhood. My partner in every adventure. My brother in every way but blood. Memories of our reckless youth came flooding back. Jackson and I had been inseparable once, but adulthood and ambition created a canyon between us. The last I'd heard, he'd moved to another state, chasing some corporate dream. And now, here he was tangled in the fabric of my life again, in the worst way possible. I spent the next hours in a haze, replaying every interaction between Emily and Jackson in my mind. Had I missed something? Were there hints? I rummaged through old photo albums, looking for clues, but all I found were shadows of happiness. The evening brought no answers, only more questions. Emily came home late, her hair smelling faintly of wine and her eyes avoiding mine. I tried to ask her about her day, but her answers were clipped, as if she was rushing to close a door I wasn't even supposed to look at. That night, I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, while she slept soundly. My mind churned. The evidence wasn't concrete, but something inside me screamed that there was more to the story. I decided I couldn't confront her until I had proof. The following morning, the house hummed with its usual rhythm. Emily sipped her coffee at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. She smiled at something on the screen, but the moment she noticed me watching, her face fell into neutrality. The disconnect between us felt almost tangible, a silent wall we were both pretending wasn't there. I drove to work with my thoughts racing. Jackson. Of all people, why Jackson? It felt like a cruel twist of fate, the kind of irony reserved for bad television dramas. But I needed more than a gut feeling and a suspicious photo. I needed to know the truth. During lunch, I made a discreet call to a private investigator. His voice was calm and professional, exactly what I needed to steady my own fraying nerves. I'll handle it discreetly, he assured me. If there's something to find, I'll find it. I left the call feeling a mix of resolve and guilt. Was I being paranoid? Was this all in my head? But the image of her laughing with Jackson haunted me. I had to know. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal. I showered Emily with affection, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman I thought I knew. She responded in kind, her laughter easy, her kisses warm, but something was different. It was in the way she pulled away a second too soon, in the way she turned her phone face down on the counter. The investigator called on Friday evening, just as Emily left for another painting session. His voice was grim. I have something you need to see. I met him at a small diner on the edge of town. He slid a manila folder across the table. This was taken 2 nights ago, he said quietly. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pictures were like daggers. Emily and Jackson, seated in the corner of an upscale restaurant, their heads close, their hands touching. In one photo, Jackson leaned across the table, whispering something into her ear, and she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years, free, radiant, like she'd forgotten the weight of the world. There's more, the investigator said, pulling out his phone. He played a video. It showed the two of them leaving the restaurant, their bodies close as they walked down the street. Then they stopped, and Jackson kissed her. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity, of intimacy. My stomach churned. I didn't remember much of the drive home. The images and the video played on a loop in my mind, a relentless assault on my sanity. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was shaking with anger and disbelief. Emily wasn't home yet. Her absence screamed louder than words ever could. I sat in the darkened living room, gripping the armrest of the couch, my mind a battlefield. Confront her? Wait? What could I even say? Around midnight, the sound of her car in the driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. She came in quietly, as if trying not to disturb me. I stood in the shadows, watching her slip off her shoes and place her bag on the counter. She froze when she saw me. "You're up late," she said, her voice light but cautious. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, my tone betraying nothing. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "Long day at the studio," she offered, then yawned dramatically. "I'm exhausted. I'm heading to bed." I nodded but didn't move. She paused for a moment, waiting for me to say something, but when I didn't, she turned and walked up the stairs. Each step felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. I sat back down, my heart pounding. The proof was undeniable, but confronting her felt like stepping into a storm I wasn't ready to face. I needed a plan. The next morning, the tension was unbearable. Emily moved around the kitchen like nothing was wrong, humming softly as she poured coffee. Her casual demeanor made my blood boil. How could she act so normal, so innocent? I watched her for a while, my anger simmering just below the surface. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Emily," I said, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "We need to talk." She froze, the coffee pot hovering over her mug. Slowly, she set it down and turned to me. "What's wrong?" she asked, feigning concern. I pulled the manila folder from the drawer where I'd hidden it and tossed it onto the counter between us. "Why don't you start by explaining this?" Her eyes widened as she stared at the photos spilling out of the folder. Her face went pale, then flushed red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Nothing to say?" I pressed, my voice rising. "No explanation for why my wife was out with my best friend, holding his hand, kissing him?" "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, finally finding her voice. I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like? Emily, there's a video of you kissing him. What part of that am I misinterpreting?" She looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a moment, I thought she might confess, might say something to justify the betrayal. Instead, she whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I stepped closer, my chest tightening. "Then how, Emily? How was it supposed to happen?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but they only fueled my anger. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. It just happened. Jackson and I. Don't you dare say his name." I snapped. "Don't you dare try to justify what you've done. You had a choice, Emily. You chose to betray me, to betray us." Her tears spilled over, but I couldn't find it in me to care. "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you. I love you." "You love me?" I scoffed. "Is that what you tell yourself while you're sneaking around with him? Was it love when you kissed him? When you spent the night with him?" She flinched like I'd struck her. "I didn't spend the night with him," she said quickly. "It was just dinner and—" "And what?" I interrupted. "You expect me to believe this was the first time? That nothing else has happened? That this was some innocent lapse in judgment?" She didn't answer. The silence was deafening. "I trusted you, Emily," I said, my voice breaking. "I trusted you with everything I am, and you threw it all away for— what? For him?" Her sobs turned into heaving breaths, but I couldn't stop. "Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To us? To our life?" "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." Her apology felt hollow, meaningless. The words didn't erase the images burned into my mind, didn't mend the jagged pieces of my heart. I turned away, unable to look at her. "I need space," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't follow me. Don't call me. I need time to figure out what to do with this." "Please don't go," she pleaded, stepping toward me. But I couldn't stay. The betrayal was suffocating, and every second in her presence felt like a fresh wound. I grabbed my keys and walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I drove aimlessly through the streets, I realized the confrontation had brought no relief, no clarity. If anything, It had only deepened the ache in my chest. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent hours driving through the city, the sun dipping lower and casting long shadows over my thoughts. My mind churned with every possible scenario, every lie she might have told, every moment Jackson and I had shared that now felt tainted. Betrayal by a wife was devastating. Betrayal by a childhood best friend? That was a knife to the soul. I pulled into a parking lot near the lake where Jackson and I used to fish as kids. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was where we'd shared so many dreams, where we'd promised to always have each other's backs. And now, he was the one who had stabbed me in mine. The sunset painted the water in fiery hues, and for a moment, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. Confronting Emily had been painful, but facing Jackson? That would be war. I found his number in my phone, his name still listed as Jack Brother. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? Hey, thanks for destroying my marriage? No, I needed to see him, to look him in the eyes when I said what I needed to say. I knew where he lived, a sleek downtown condo that screamed success, the kind he'd always chased. It was only a short drive, and my hands gripped the wheel tightly as I approached the building. The doorman recognized me and waved me through with a friendly smile, unaware of the storm I carried. When I knocked on Jackson's door, it swung open faster than I expected. There he was, the same confident grin plastered on his face as always. But when he saw me, his expression faltered. "Hey man," he said cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you here." I pushed past him into the apartment. "Cut the crap, Jackson." His brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "You know damn well what's going on," I snapped, throwing the manila folder onto his glass coffee table. The photos spilled out like a dam breaking, their truth undeniable. Jackson stared at them, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a deep sigh, he dropped onto the couch. "I was going to tell you." "Tell me?" I shouted. "Tell me what? That you've been sneaking around with my wife? That you've been betraying me while I trusted you with my life?" He ran a hand through his hair, his usual swagger replaced by something that resembled guilt. "It wasn't like that. Don't you dare try to downplay this," I growled. "You, of all people, knew what she meant to me. What our marriage meant." Jackson stood, his voice rising. "And what about me? You think it was easy for me? Watching you live this perfect life while you what? Took what didn't belong to you." I shot back. He stepped closer, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't get it. You have everything, Emily, the house, the family. And me? I've got nothing. So, that justifies this? You're pathetic." I spat. The words hit him hard, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing. Then Jackson spoke, his voice low and bitter. "She came to me, all right? She was the one who reached out. Said she felt suffocated, unappreciated. I didn't go looking for this. I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. Emily had confided in him, had turned to him instead of coming to me. She's been unhappy for a while," he continued. "I told her to talk to you, but she said you wouldn't listen." "She's my wife," I said through gritted teeth. "She owed me honesty. Not this." Jackson's face hardened. "And I owed you loyalty. I know. I screwed up, but don't pretend you're perfect. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to her." I lunged at him, grabbing his collar and shoving him against the wall. "You don't get to blame me for your betrayal." He didn't fight back, his hands hanging limply at his sides. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Hit me. You'll feel better." I let go, stepping back as disgust washed over me. Not just at him, but at the situation, at myself for ever letting this happen. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "You were supposed to be my brother." Jackson didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The anger that had fueled me drained away, leaving only a hollow ache. As I drove home, one thought repeated in my mind. This wasn't over. Not for him, not for Emily, and not for me. The drive home was a blur of headlights and shadows, the anger inside me simmering into something darker, resolve. I couldn't let them walk away from this unscathed. Emily and Jackson had made their choices. and now they would face the consequences. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my mind was clear. I wasn't going to let my emotions dictate my actions. I needed to be smart, methodical. If they were going to betray me, I'd make sure they paid for it, each in their own way. I stayed up all night researching every bank account, every shared asset, every detail of Emily's life that I could use to gain leverage. Our home, our savings, even the small art gallery where she occasionally displayed her work. It was all part of the picture I was piecing together. If she thought she could just waltz back into her life as if nothing had happened, she was sorely mistaken. By morning, I had a rough plan, but there was still one more piece of the puzzle I needed: her truth. I didn't just want an apology. I wanted the whole story. How long had it been going on? How deep did their betrayal run? Emily was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, nursing a cup of coffee like it was any other day. The sight of her, calm, collected, and completely oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, ignited a fresh wave of anger. But I kept my composure. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. She looked up, startled, as if she thought the confrontation from the day before had settled things. "I don't know what else I can say, Adam," she murmured. "I've already apologized." I pulled out a chair and sat across from her, folding my hands on the table. "I don't want an apology. I want the truth. All of it." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I told you it wasn't what you think." I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. "Then make me understand, Emily. Help me see how betraying me with Jackson wasn't what it so obviously was." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break. But instead, she straightened, her expression hardening. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth? Here it is." She began to talk, her voice laced with anger and guilt. She told me about the late nights, the growing distance between us, and how she felt more like a fixture in my life than a partner. "I was lonely, Adam," she said. "You were always so focused on work, on providing, on everything but us." "And Jackson was your solution?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Her eyes flashed with anger. "He listened to me. He made me feel seen. I never planned for it to go this far, but it did." I finished for her. "Because you let it." She didn't deny it, and the silence that followed was suffocating. "I'm done being the only one fighting for this marriage," I said finally, my voice low. "You want to feel seen? Congratulations, Emily. Everyone's about to see exactly who you are." Her brow furrowed in confusion, but I didn't elaborate. Instead, I stood and left the kitchen, heading straight to my office. There was more work to be done. That night, while Emily slept in the guest room, her silent way of acknowledging the rift between us, I began setting my plan in motion. I contacted a lawyer, laying out the situation in detail. I wanted to ensure that when the dust settled, Emily wouldn't walk away with a single penny more than she was entitled to. If she wanted out, she could have it, but on my terms. As for Jackson, his reckoning would come soon enough. I spent hours digging into his life, uncovering little details he probably thought were buried. His reputation was pristine, but I knew better than anyone how fragile that could be. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds, I felt something I hadn't in days: control. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they hadn't seen what I was capable of. The real game was just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of calculated moves. Emily had no idea what I was up to, and I intended to keep it that way. She went about her days as if we were in some tense truce, her attempts at small talk falling flat against the silence I gave her in return. But behind closed doors, I was laying the groundwork for my retribution. I started with Jackson. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned Jackson had been angling for a promotion at his company, a position that required a spotless record and the trust of his colleagues. I couldn't think of a better way to disrupt his ambitions. I compiled every piece of evidence I had: photos, the video from the private investigator, even old emails Emily had written him that I found on our shared computer. It was enough to ruin him. With a fake email address and a carefully worded message, I sent the evidence to his company's HR department. I didn't bother being subtle. The subject line read, "Your employee's affair with a married woman." Attached were the damning files: along with a note urging them to consider whether this is the kind of person you want representing your company. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. 2 days later, I received an email notification that Jackson's LinkedIn profile had been updated. His position was now listed as former employee. I smiled, imagining the humiliation he must have felt walking out of that office with his head low. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Emily's turn was next. I wasn't interested in petty revenge. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. Her small art gallery, the place she'd poured her heart into, was heavily dependent on the support of a few key patrons. I reached out to them anonymously, hinting at her affair and sharing just enough detail to sow doubt about her character. It was amazing how quickly whispers could turn into shouts. Within a week, her gallery was practically deserted. The patrons she'd once counted on stopped returning her calls, and her upcoming exhibitions were quietly canceled. She came home one night, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why everyone's pulling out." I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe they found out you're not as trustworthy as they thought." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might put the pieces together. But she didn't. Instead, she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But the final blow came from a place even I hadn't anticipated. One evening, as I sifted through our financial records, I found an account I didn't recognize. It was in Emily's name, hidden among the paperwork for her gallery. My hands shook as I opened it, and the numbers on the screen made my stomach turn. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into this account over the past year, with Jackson Corporate Consulting listed as the recipient. I confronted her that same night. "What is this?" I demanded, shoving the printed statement in front of her. She glanced at it, her face draining of color. I can explain." "Then start talking," I growled. "Because it looks like you've been paying him." She stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "He helped me get the gallery started. I was paying him back. With our money?" I cut her off. "You've been lying to me, betraying me, and now I find out you've been siphoning off our savings for him?" Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing. "I didn't mean for it to get so complicated," she sobbed. "I was trying to handle it myself. I didn't want to burden you." "Burden me?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You didn't want to burden me, so you lied? So you betrayed me?" "I was scared," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was scared of losing everything." "Well, congratulations," I said coldly. "You've succeeded." That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Emily and Jackson had built their web of lies, and now it was unraveling around them. But as much satisfaction as it brought, I knew this was only the beginning. There was still one more move to make. The revelations about Emily's secret payments to Jackson had opened a door I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just an affair, it was an entire web of deceit. And now, I had every reason to tear it all down. The next day, I called my lawyer. I'd already discussed the logistics of divorce, but now I wanted to escalate. I instructed him to freeze our joint accounts and begin the process of filing for separation. I wasn't going to let Emily siphon another cent of our money, especially not if Jackson was anywhere near it. "Adam," my lawyer said cautiously, "are you sure you want to move this quickly? Once you file, there's no turning back." I didn't hesitate. "Do it." Emily found out that afternoon when her debit card was declined at the grocery store. She came home in a fury, slamming the door behind her. "What the hell is going on?" she shouted, waving her phone at me. "Why can't I access our accounts?" I looked up from my laptop, my expression calm. "Because they're not our accounts anymore." Her face contorted with anger and disbelief. "You can't do this. You can't just cut me off." "Oh, I can," I replied, my voice sharp. "You lost the right to call it ours the moment you decided to fund your affair with Jackson." "It wasn't an affair," she snapped, but the crack in her voice betrayed her. "You stood telling over here." "Don't you dare insult my intelligence, Emily. I have the photos, the videos, the bank statements. I know everything." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked defeated. "I made a mistake," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. A mistake? I scoffed. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. It was a choice. A deliberate, selfish choice. And now, you'll face the consequences. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. Save it. I'm done listening to your excuses. The next day, I made my move against Jackson. The email I'd sent to his HR department had been satisfying, but it was time for a more personal touch. I still had his business cards, evidence of his so-called consulting work. Using them, I created a detailed dossier outlining the payments Emily had made and the intimate nature of their relationship. It wasn't hard to connect the dots, and the picture it painted was damning. I mailed copies of the dossier to his colleagues, his clients, and even his family. I wanted everyone in his life to know exactly who he was. If he thought he could walk away from this unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. The fallout came faster than I expected. By the end of the week, Jackson's world was in shambles. He lost his remaining clients, and whispers about his inappropriate relationships spread through his professional network like wildfire. A mutual friend told me he'd been forced to sell his condo to cover debts that had suddenly come due. As for Emily, her gallery was barely hanging on. The patrons I'd contacted had abandoned her, and the whispers about her affair had made their way through the local art community. The very people who once championed her now avoided her calls. One evening, as I sat in the living room, Emily approached me cautiously. She looked thinner, her once vibrant face now etched with lines of stress and regret. Adam, she began, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I didn't look up. What is there to say? She hesitated, then sat down across from me. I know I've hurt you, she said quietly. I know I've broken your trust, but I don't want to lose you. I finally met her gaze, my expression cold. You already have. Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. I don't know how to fix this, she sobbed. I don't know how to make it right. You can't, I said bluntly. And honestly, I don't think you ever really wanted to. If you did, you wouldn't have let it get this far. She looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. I love you, Adam. I never stopped loving you. I shook my head, my voice bitter. Love isn't just a word, Emily. It's actions, choices. And you've shown me exactly what your choices are. For the first time, she didn't argue. She simply sat there, silent, as the weight of her actions finally seemed to settle over her. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a strange sense of clarity. The anger that had consumed me was fading, replaced by something more powerful, freedom. I had taken control of the situation, and now, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle, or so I thought. The storm that Emily and Jackson had created in my life had wreaked havoc, but I'd started to rebuild. The divorce proceedings were underway, and I had no intention of dragging them out. I wanted closure, not endless battles. But then, the unexpected happened. It was a Thursday afternoon when my lawyer called. His voice, usually calm and professional, carried an edge of urgency. Adam, there's something you need to see. Can you come to the office? What's going on? I asked, my stomach nodding. It's about Jackson, he said cryptically. I think it changes everything. I drove to the office, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Jackson have done now? When I arrived, my lawyer handed me a folder. Inside was a letter, written in Jackson's unmistakable scrawl. It read, Adam, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. I know there's nothing I can say to undo the damage I've caused, but I need you to know the truth. Emily, and I didn't start this to hurt you. I swear to God, we didn't. It began as something innocent, or at least I thought it was. She came to me, confiding about her struggles, about how she felt like she was losing you. I wanted to help her, to help you both. But somewhere along the way, things got out of control. What you don't know is that Emily was never fully committed to whatever this was between us. She pulled back more than once, said it was wrong, said she loved you. And I didn't listen. I kept pushing. I thought if I could just prove I was better for her, she'd choose me. But she never did. I've lost everything now. My job, my reputation, my friendships. Even my family looks at me like I'm a stranger. And you? You've won, Adam. You've taken everything from me, and I deserve it. But there's one more thing you need to know, and it's the hardest truth of all. Emily never stopped loving you. She told me that, even when we were together, she said she made a mistake, that she didn't know how to fix it. And now, I don't know if it's too late for you too, but I hope you'll at least hear her out. You've been my brother for as long as I can remember, and I'll carry the guilt of betraying you to my grave. I'm sorry, Adam, for everything. Jackson. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. It was hard to process the jumble of emotions that hit me. Anger, confusion, even a flicker of pity. Jackson's words didn't absolve him of what he'd done, but they painted a picture of someone who had destroyed himself in the process of trying to take what wasn't his. Is this real? I asked my lawyer. It was delivered to my office anonymously, he said. But based on the handwriting, I'd say yes. I left the office in a daze, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. When I got home, Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when I entered, her eyes widening as she saw the paper in my hand. "What's that?" she asked nervously. "Jackson," I said simply, tossing the letter onto the coffee table. She hesitated, then picked it up. As she read, tears streamed down her face. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me, her expression raw and vulnerable. "I didn't know he wrote this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't change anything," I replied coldly. "Maybe not," she said, wiping her eyes. "But he's right about one thing. I never stopped loving you, Adam." I laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it." "I know I don't deserve another chance," she said, her voice trembling. "But if there's even a small part of you that still feels something for me, please, don't shut the door completely." I stared at her, the woman I'd once loved more than anything, now reduced to someone I barely recognized. Her words lingered, tugging at the frayed edges of my heart. But could I trust her again? Did I even want to? The revelation left me reeling. Jackson's letter was a confession, an apology, and a plea all wrapped into one. But as I lay awake that night, one thought haunted me. Could I truly move on while carrying the weight of all that had happened? Or was there still something worth saving in the wreckage of our lives? For days, Jackson's letter haunted me. His words were heavy, soaked with regret, but they didn't absolve him or Emily. Still, they stirred something inside me I hadn't felt in weeks, doubt. Not about what they'd done, but about what came next. Emily's plea echoed in my mind, too. "Don't shut the door completely," she'd said, her voice trembling with sincerity. It was the kind of vulnerability I hadn't seen in her for years. But was it real? Or just another manipulation, another way to salvage what she'd thrown away? I needed clarity. That weekend, I packed a small bag and drove out to the cabin my family used to visit during summers. It was secluded, nestled in the woods, far from the chaos of my unraveling life. I left my phone off, disconnected from everything. For the first time in weeks, the silence was deafening, but also strangely comforting. The first night, I sat by the fireplace, sipping a glass of whiskey and staring at the flames. My mind replayed every moment of the past few months, trying to make sense of it all. Where had things gone so wrong? Was it me? Was it her? Or was it just the slow erosion of a marriage stretched too thin by time and circumstance? By the second day, the anger began to fade. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, but the sharp edges of my pain were softening, replaced by an aching sadness. I thought about the man I used to be, the man who had stood at the altar and promised Emily forever. That man had believed in love, in loyalty, in the unshakable bond of marriage. But now I wasn't sure who I was anymore. On the third day, I made a decision. It wasn't about reconciliation or revenge. It was about closure. I drove back to the city, feeling a strange sense of purpose. Emily deserved to know where I stood, and I deserved to say it to her face. For better or worse, this would be the end or a new beginning. When I walked into the house, Emily was in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner. She looked up when she saw me, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You're back," she said softly. I nodded, setting my bag down. We need to talk. She dried her hands on a towel, then sat at the kitchen table, waiting. I joined her, the weight of the moment settling between us. I've been thinking, I began, about everything, about us. She didn't interrupt, just listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I'm not going to pretend I'm over what you did, I said. Because I'm not. You betrayed me, Emily. You and Jackson both. And that's not something I can just forget. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't speak. That said, I continued, I don't want to live in anger forever. I can't. It's exhausting, and it's not who I want to be. Her voice was barely a whisper. What does that mean? It means I'm willing to consider moving forward, I said carefully. But it's going to take time. A lot of time, and it's going to take work. Real work. From both of us. The tears spilled over, and she nodded quickly. I'll do anything, Adam. Anything. I held up a hand. This isn't a guarantee, Emily. It's not forgiveness. Not yet. It's just a chance. Her shoulders shook as she cried. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger toward her. Not love. Not yet, but a glimmer of hope. Later that night, as I lay in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Could we rebuild what had been broken? Or was this just delaying the inevitable? For now, all I knew was that I'd taken the first step. Where the path led from here was uncertain, but at least it was a path I'd chosen. The days that followed were awkward and tense, but there was a shift, small, fragile, but unmistakable. Emily tiptoed around the house, careful with her words and actions, while I kept my distance emotionally. We lived like uneasy roommates, circling around the unspoken question. Could we really fix this? I wasn't sure, but I was willing to try. The first real test came a week later. I found Emily in the kitchen, staring at her phone with a mixture of fear and determination. When she noticed me, she hesitated, then placed the phone on the counter. It's Jackson, she said quietly. He's been calling. My stomach tightened, the anger threatening to bubble over again. And I blocked his number, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted you to know. I studied her face, searching for any hint of dishonesty, but there was none. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something resembling trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily threw herself into therapy, attending sessions twice a week. She asked me to join her, but I wasn't ready. Instead, I focused on myself. I began running again, clearing my mind on the trails near our house. I reconnected with old friends I'd pushed away during the turmoil. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. One evening, Emily handed me a small notebook. What's this? I asked. It's everything, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Every question you've had. Every answer I couldn't say out loud. I wrote it all down. I hesitated, the weight of the notebook in my hands feeling heavier than it should. Why? Because I want you to know the truth, she said. Even if it hurts, even if it means you'll never forgive me. I opened the first page that night, my heart pounding. The entries were raw and unfiltered, each one peeling back another layer of her guilt, her confusion, her regret. She detailed every moment she'd spent with Jackson, every lie she'd told, every doubt she'd had about her choices. By the time I reached the final entry, I was in tears. It wasn't just an account of her betrayal. It was an admission of her brokenness, of the ways she'd let herself and our marriage fall apart. For the first time, I began to see her not as the villain of my story, but as a flawed human being who had made terrible choices. It didn't erase the pain, but it shifted something inside me. Months passed, and slowly, we began to rebuild. There were setbacks, moments of anger, of mistrust, of doubt, but we faced them together. Emily worked tirelessly to prove her commitment, while I worked to rebuild my sense of self. The day I finally forgave her wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning as we sat on the porch drinking coffee. She reached over and took my hand, her touch hesitant but hopeful. I know I don't deserve this, she said softly, but thank you for giving me another chance. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. We're not there yet, I said, but maybe we will be. As for Jackson, I never heard from him again. His departure from our lives was a bitter blessing, a necessary end to a friendship that had once meant everything. I didn't need his apology or his presence. Letting him go was the easiest part of the process. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The scars of betrayal never fully disappeared, and there were days when the past threatened to consume us. But we faced it together, step by painful step, learning to build something new out of the wreckage. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and what would you do in my situation.